Hi, I'm Pastor Steve Talmage of Love of Christ Lutheran Church in Mesa, Arizona. And this week, I'd like to have us take a look at Isaiah chapter 44, verses 6 to 8. That's the Old Testament reading assigned to Sunday, July 19th, 2020. Isaiah, many of you may know, is one of the major prophets of the Jewish Bible and our Old Testament. And what makes a prophet a major prophet is the fact that their writings cover a long period of time. And most Bible scholars place the writings of Isaiah between 740 BC, before Christ or before the Common Era, to 490 BC or BCE. So you're looking at a scope of about 250 years. So Isaiah is one of the big boys, big major prophets. Most scholars like to divide Isaiah into three sections. Three different voices of Isaiah speaking at three different historical times. The first Isaiah covers 740 BC BCE to about 700 BC BCE, and it covers chapters 1 to 33. Most scholars put chapters 34 and 39 at a later era. Second Isaiah, which our reading comes out of, is from 587 BC to 538. So it's a little shorter time period. And then that covers chapters 40 to 55, and it's the time of the fall of the temple, the fall of the walls and city of Jerusalem to the Babylonians, and the displacement or exile of many of the Israelites in the Babylonian Empire. Then third Isaiah is written from 538 to 490, and that covers chapters 56 to 66, and that's after the exiles have returned to Israel under King Cyrus's edict that any of the former exiles or descendants of the Israelites who want to go back are free to go back and rebuild the city of Jerusalem and the temple that had been destroyed. So that covers chapters 56 to 66. When you're reading many of the prophets in the Old Testament, they generally have about 5 major themes that they speak to as usually the source of why they're having problems, why they're maybe experiencing judgment, why in this case they've been exiled. You see that the first is always idolatry. First commandment, you shall have no other gods before me. And throughout the history of Israel, the leadership, particularly the kings, often compromised the monotheism of Israel and allowed the worship of other gods. The second is injustice. And injustice is usually expressed in stories or examples of exploitation and oppression of those who are most vulnerable in the community, in the nation, in the society. Often lifting up the widows and the orphans or the poor. Ingratitude is another major theme. When the people of God fail to remember who God is and whose they are, or remembering that the whole adventure of becoming God's chosen people and inheriting the promised land was pure grace, pure gift, they or their ancestors need to remember over and over again, and the prophets try to remind them that they did nothing to be chosen or to inherit what God had provided. The fourth major theme is immorality, particularly as it related to sacrifices involving cultic prostitutes, where it was taught by engaging in these cultic sexual intercourse acts, it would affect the fertility of one's crops, one's livestock, or even their own descendants, particularly children, to take over their well-being and their family. The fifth is empty ritualism. The prophets will speak to this sense that believing believing that going through the motions of worship on the Sabbath day, of praising God and affirming faith in God on the Sabbath day is all that God cares about, when in fact, many of the prophets indict the business leaders, the political leaders, that there's a disconnect between what they're saying out of their mouths and their lips on the Sabbath day in worship and how they practice and conduct their business and political affairs in the course of daily life. There's an incongruity, inconsistency, and the hypocrisy causes the prophets to raise strong words of judgment. Our lesson, as I said earlier, comes out of 2nd Isaiah, speaking to those who have either been in exile or are descendants of exiles following the fall of Jerusalem in 587 BC. The prophet in 2nd Isaiah affirms God will continue to be faithful to the covenants made to their ancestors, and that they would be delivered from captivity, which happened around 538 BCE during the time of Ezra and Nehemiah in the Old Testament, where these folks came back and they resettled the land and rebuilt the walls and began rebuilding the temple. Let's listen to our very brief reading out of Isaiah 44. Thus says the Lord. That's a typical prophet speaking, that they don't speak for themselves. They are speaking on behalf of God. Thus says the Lord, the King of Israel and his Redeemer, the Lord of hosts. I am the first and I am the last. Besides me, there is no God. Who is like me? Let them proclaim it. Let them declare and set it forth before me. Who has announced from of old the things to come? Let them tell us what is yet to be. Do not fear or be afraid. Have I not told you from of old and declared it? You are my witnesses. Is there any God besides me? There is no other rock. I know not one. In our lesson, the prophet affirms clearly that the God of Israel, Yahweh, is the one God to trust and worship when the Babylonians had many gods you could choose from. The prophet identifies the God of Israel in multiple ways in this very brief passage. He calls him the Lord, Yahweh, the God who was, is, and will be, the main name of God in the Jewish Bible. The prophet calls the Lord the King of Israel. Part of the reason why the people of Israel were exiled was due to the fact that the whole issue was that they wanted a human king. They wanted to be like other nations and live under the rule of a human king, when in fact the prophet Samuel had cursed the people and told them the only king they need is Yahweh, the Lord. They're not to be like everyone else, but the Lord gave them a king. First in Saul, then David, then the various ancestors following. Then the prophet calls the Lord Redeemer. The Lord is the one who pays the price. The Lord is the one who pays the ransom. The Lord is the person who sets a person free or pays that debt owed to secure something put up for collateral. The Lord is our Redeemer. Then we have this idea of the Lord of hosts. Though we have no idea how the Lord and the heavenly hosts may appear, we have artists over the centuries trying to capture our imagination. But the God of 2nd Isaiah is the Lord of hosts, meaning the full company of heaven is serving and working God's will on earth as it is in heaven. Though we see the title first and last often associated with Jesus, here the prophet reminds the people of the eternal nature of the God of Israel, of Yahweh. The God we worship is the one who has the first and will always have the last word. At the end of our reading, we hear, "Is there any God besides me? There is no other rock. I know not one." We might remember the words of Jesus centuries later, telling the crowds the story of two men building a home. One foolishly built their house upon the sand. The other, the wise man, built his house upon the rock. When the storms came, the foolish man's home was destroyed, but the wise man's home stood secure. As the exiles anticipate returning to the promised land, there will be choices to make. The pursuit of other gods will continue to be prevalent just as it is today. But there will also be the choice to build their future on the rock that is everlasting. In closing, some questions. When you think of Isaiah's descriptions of the Lord in this very brief passage, how does that shape your understanding of who God is? When you have felt the pain of defeat, the pain of despair, the pain of desolation or depression, how has that impacted your faith, trust, and confidence in the Lord? What allows you, particularly during this time of physical social distancing, great uncertainty, and isolation, to trust that God is with us? And we do not need, as the prophet said, we do not need to fear or be afraid. And finally, how does your understanding of Jesus Christ reflect the Lord who is King, Redeemer, Lord of hosts, first and last, and the rock on which you build your life? God bless you as you go into this week. God bless you as you hold on to the promise of Isaiah. God bless you wherever you may find yourself. And I hope and pray that you're safe, that you're well, and that these ancient words from Isaiah might bring you comfort and courage. God bless you.